Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. What we're going to be focusing today is we're going to be focusing on importing elements into Adobe After Effects for the purpose of placement and animation, and a couple of things that kind of go along with that. Now this is going to be a little bit of a longer video, so please be prepared. But the first thing I want to do is I want to explain exactly how the video is going to be imported in. Now, what we're taking a look at here is an Adobe Illustrator file. Now, one thing I do want to show in this is the three different types of pictures that we have in here, or three different layers that we have in here, I should say. We have a normal square, we have a normal triangle, and we also have this little shape over here, a ball with a star inside of it. Now, important thing to kind of keep in mind, if you want these to be separate from each other when you actually bring them into After Effects, you need to make sure that they're on separate layers, like what I have over here. Didn't bother giving them a special name, just kept them as layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. Now, as long as you have these, you can have unlimited amount of elements inside of here, and that'd be perfectly fine. So just to kind of show my point in here, I'm going to make myself an extra little shape. Nothing too fancy, just basically bringing this in like so. And I'm just going to change the color as well to, let's just make this another red. Just because we can. All right, just going to bring this up a little bit more. Cool. Now, when I made this, I made sure that the layer 2, the one with the ball in it, was specifically selected for this. There's a pretty good reason for that, as I do want these to be separate from each other. But as long as I said before, they're different layers. You can basically have as many sub-layers as you want to basically make this work. But we won't keep it too complicated this time. All right, so now that this is done, I'm going to save this inside my demo folder. And I'm not going to keep it complicated, just an untitled one should be sufficient. I'm going to replace it, totally fine. And once again, I don't want to make this very complicated, although for future reference, if you hit the drop down over here, you can actually save it as previous versions of Illustrator. And in some cases, this could be useful if you're working on an older version at home or anything the like. But right now, I'm working with the current version, so I'm good. All right. Now, I'm just going to minimize this. And I'm going to review how to make a new composition, because that's always good to do in terms of review, and a couple of things that's going to help us with this project and for future runs later on. Now again, you could either go to New Composition, or alternatively, I can go to Composition over here, New Composition, doesn't matter which one you do. If you do need to change things up a little bit later, it's good to know about the New Composition and Composition settings though. Now, in this case, I'm going to actually change the name to Animation Comp, so I know exactly what it is. The size, I'm going to keep this once again at a 720p resolution. All the other elements are going to be relatively the same with one exception. In this case, I'm going to change the frame rate to 24. Now the reason why I'm doing this is when we start animating with Animate, our ideal frame rate for this is going to be 24 frames a second. So we want to make sure that we keep this as consistent as possible. Now in terms of the duration, we'll keep it at 10 for now. If we feel that we need some more later, we will be able to add that in. Background color could be whatever you want. I'm going to keep things simple, and I'm just going to keep this as a black background for now. Well, looks like I'm pretty much ready to go. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to import this in, this being my Illustrator file. So again, File, Import, File again. And I'm going to go to, again, my desktop, although, again, you could pretty much save it wherever you want, but do keep track of where you do save your stuff. And yeah, so my untitled one, I'm going to just bring this in like so. Now, it's going to give you a couple options that you really need to take track of when you're working with this. First thing to keep track of is make sure that if you want this to kind of go in as separate elements, you don't want to put this as footage. You actually would want to import this in as composition, retain layer sizes. This will basically make sure that each of the individual layers will go in the way that they're supposed to. You could also try to do this as composition. I don't recommend doing it this way though, as it'll basically make the elements, basically the grabbing area, the size of your composition. Now, that's not going to make too much sense right now, but when we get into it, it is going to be very vital that you keep them separate like this. Now, they also have some options for making it a sequence and so on, but we're going to keep this very simple. Just import it in as a composition, retain layers. It's already selected, so we're good, and I'm going to import. Fantastic. So one thing to kind of keep in mind when you import this in is it does bring this in as its own composition. And yep, here's my untitled one. I could double click here, and there's the actual composition itself, or I should say timeline. Now, each of them, as I showed you before, basically have their own very specific type of layer over here. That's normal and okay. But again, I really don't need this as the composition. All I really wanted were these three different objects. Now, kind of to remind you guys about the difference between composition, retained size, and just regular composition. If I did this as a regular composition, anytime I select any of these or try to, it would select the whole screen. That would be counterproductive to what we want to do. So that's why I said retain layer size. But anyways, I'm not going to keep this for now. I do want to use my main composition. But the big thing that's kind of nice about this is if I go into my layers, I can actually import these in straight away. Now there's two differences, once again, for importing this in. If I click and drag this to the actual screen itself, then I can basically put it wherever I want. However, if I just click and drag this down to the timeline, it'll try and keep this as in place, in this case in the center, as best it can. So that is something to kind of keep in mind. I'm just going to import them all in so that we can see them. Fantastic. All right, so that looks pretty good, at least for what we're going to be doing today. Now, what we want to do next, now that they're all imported and they're all put in the timeline, we want to have the option to actually manipulate these with a little bit more precision. Now, this can be done if you hit the drop down over here, and what you'll see is an option called Transform. Now, in the Transform area, you can hit the little drop down over here, and you'll see some more options available. One called Anchor Point, one called Position, one called Scale, one called Rotation, and one called Opacity. Now, each of these does, obviously, something different to the actual object of choice. And the pretty much explanation is pretty standard. Basically what we have, but we'll start with the position, scale, and rotation for now, since those are usually the most common ones most people are going to take advantage of. What the position is going to do is, if you were to change any of these numbers, left, right, up, and down, you'll basically see that there's going to be a difference in how it changes. Now, neat thing about this is the left number, this is what's called your X value. And when I say traveling X, you're going to be going side to side. The one to the right is going to be called your Y value. And this basically brings this up and down like so. Now the X and Y axis, or values that you see over here, is going to be important to remember. If someone asks you to change it in a very specific way, it's good to just kind of remember which is which at this time. Now, there's also options for scale. Now, by default, it actually scales the X value and Y value simultaneously, trying to keep that look as consistent as you can. So if you need to make an object bigger or smaller, it's pretty easy to do. And if you need to put it back to stock, just change the number to 100, and it puts it back to its original size. Now you can also select this constraint proportion, looks like a little chain, and that will basically let you scale in one direction or the other. Remember, Control-Z is your friend. Now, the rotation allows you, as you figured, rotate left and right. And that's what the right number will allow you to do. Now, the left number we're not going to get too much into yet, but we will get into when it comes to animation. Basically, what this does, to just give you a brief overview, is anytime that we get to about 359, once it gets to 360, that left number will change, basically making it one revolution, like so. And of course, we want to change it back to normal. We can just change both numbers back, and we should be good. By the way, if you do accidentally hit enter on one of the objects, you're going to be in this kind of isolation mode. To get out of there, just hit the X on that particular part, and it should put you back to your composition. This is a good thing to know every so often. So those, again, are the three that you're going to be working with the most. And again, for these, you could actually just select this manually if you want to do that. You could also use the rotation over here to move this manually, should you want to go that route. And you could even just go to the corners, if you're in regular selection, to play around with the scale. I usually don't recommend doing it that way, but to each their own. Oh, and also, like before, if you hold down Shift key while you're scaling, it'll basically scale both sides at the same time. So that's basically the general thing that you could do with this, and all the different layers have the same options. So again, if I hit the little arrow over here and hit the arrow by the transform, basically does the same thing. All right. Now, the ones that are a little less common are going to be the anchor point and the opacity. Now, these are going to be important ones to know as well, because at least with the anchor point, what that basically entails, and I'll zoom in a little bit. Now, you can zoom in by using the little zoom option over here. I'm just going to try and fit this to screen. That's a little bit better. You could also scale in a little bit more like so, or alternatively, you could use the Z key or just use the zoom tool over here. So pretty much, if you remember your Photoshop and Illustrator training, similar principles apply to this. And also, the space bar and hold will pan around like so. Important details to remember. Now, as I was saying, the anchor point, what that does is it basically takes this little middle point over here and allows you to move it anywhere else. Now, the reason why this is important to know is if you wanted the rotation or the scale to be in a different position, this is how you do it. Now, this can be done by just using the numbers. Again, you can use the left to right and up and down to move this wherever you please. Or alternatively, and this is a new shortcut, you can use what's called the pan behind anchor point tool to get there, or the Y tool. So again, it's to the left, the right of the camera, the left of our shape here, or rectangle tool. Just click that, and you can basically move this wherever you want. So why would we ever want to move this? Well, that's pretty easy. If I go to the rotation again, instead of rotating from the middle, and I'll show you how this looks first. So, pretty standard. Again, if I use the pan behind tool, move this straight down. Again, hold shift if you want to keep it straight. Now if I try and rotate it, it rotates over there. Again, for some more advanced stuff, that is going to be incredibly helpful for you. So again, pan behind tool, anchor point tool, basically moves this little point so that you can change how your shape will be manipulated. And also note that if I did bring this down, and again, I'm just moving this straight up, it also has an effect on your scale, as you can see over here. So instead of scaling from the middle, it basically is going to scale like this. And again, if you're doing this if you're not constraining this, it also has a big factor in this. So just some facts to kind of remember with that. Now the last one is what's called the opacity. Now what this will do, as it sounds, it'll allow you to turn off your visibility completely or make it just a little bit transparent. So if I wanted to bring this over a little bit, and again, this is at the highest layer, that's why I'm seeing this a little bit the way that I do, you're going to notice that it basically covers this. But if I turn down the opacity, it's far more transparent, making that a potential look depending on what you're trying to go for. And that's stuff we're going to go over in class. So that's basically what your main transformations will do. Now, here's a little bit of a shortcut in case you just need one particular part. If you just, for example, needed to do the anchor point, hit A, that gets you to anchor point. If you need to get to position, you hit P, and that gets you right to position. If you hit R, that gets you to rotation. S gets you to scale. So those four ones are pretty easy to remember. Just remember the first letter. For those, and you should be good. Now the shortcut for opacity, the last one, isn't going to be O. That's actually reserved for something else. T would be the actual shortcut for opacity. So it's a little bit jarring at first, but once you understand how that works, you're pretty much good to go. And if you hit the shortcut key a second time, so I hit the T again, it closes that little area for you. But once again, depending on how you're approaching this and depending on what you're doing, it might be better off if you're going to be showing all the transformations at the same time. Say, for example, if you use 2 or more, it's definitely good to know the difference. And then, of course, if you want to just use 1, that's why the shortcut keys are there. So hopefully that explains what the transformations will do. Now, what I want to show next is how to do some basic motion, some basic animation for this. Now, a couple things to kind of keep in mind before we get into the actual animation itself is the following. The way that the timeline is set up currently is basically it's put by seconds and frames. So, if you basically see out of these 4 numbers, the 2 to the right are going to be your frames, the 2 to the left are going to be your seconds. If you have a timeline that goes into minutes, you'll start seeing those numbers too. But it tries to keep things relatively simple, at least at first. Now, this area over here is your zoom. It allows you to zoom in directly into your keyframes, making that part a lot easier to deal with. Okay, now we're not going to get too complicated with our animation to get started. We'll just do some very simple motion just so you can get a feel for it. And later on, we'll try to do some more complicated elements. So again, I'm going to move these other ones a little bit out of the way. And this one I'm going to move up here, and this one I'm going to move down here. You can also move stuff outside the timeline, and it's perfectly fine. You just won't see it. So in some cases, it's kind of like Illustrator like that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make myself a very simple ball motion. So it's not going to be perfect, but it would be good enough for what we're doing today. So let's take a look at the ball. And I'm going to take a look at all my transformations because that's going to be useful for me. Now, in terms of basically how I'm going to approach this, I'm going to start off with a simple position. Now, what you're going to want to do is, again, my timeline's at the very beginning, and I'm just going to keep my actual timeline itself for about maybe 5 seconds. So I'm just making sure I have enough to see there. Okay, there we are. Okay. So now that I have at least the 5 seconds seen, there we are. Let's actually get this moving. Now, the way that you could do motion or animation is next to all the transformations, there's these little stopwatch icons. This is basically the exact name is time vary stopwatch toggle ability for properties to change over time. Or basically, this is where you could start what's called your keyframes. Think of these as start and stop points. So when you actually start this up, you're basically setting up your first key. So it's a good idea to make sure your time slider is at the beginning or wherever you want this to begin. In this case, I want to keep this simple, so I'm good here. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go to about half a second. So once again, if you remember what I said earlier, 24 frames equal 1 second. So half of 24 frames is going to be 12. There we are. Now I can just move this up like so. Now what you're going to see here is a little line that basically represents my little path motion. And anytime that I make a movement and move the time slider, that's going to basically make what's called an auto key or another start and stop point. So let's see what I did here. So if I move my time slider back, it basically starts at the beginning. If I move my time slider forward, we basically have that. Now I'm going to move to about 1 second. I'm going to move this downwards like so. I'm going to try and line these 2 areas up. Looks like it's working pretty nicely actually. Going to go to 1.5 seconds. Going to bring this up a little bit, not quite as much though. And I'm going to bring this down. And again, every time I make a motion, it works like that. And again, move this forward. And move this down. By the way, little mental note, you can actually, with the regular selection tool, you can actually select these keys and move them wherever you want. It's an advantage of being able to see the timeline of sorts You just need to make sure you select your object, and you can change the motion however you need to. And yeah, that's pretty much all I would need to do there. And I'm going to move this right off screen at about second 5. Fantastic. Now, if you want to get a little preview of that, you can either hit the play in the preview area over here, or just hit the space bar, and that'll just make a very quick little preview to see how your motion's coming out. Again, the play button also pretty much does the same thing. And that's how basic animation works. Now, neat thing about how this keyframe structure is stated, basically you don't have to worry about scaling everything or rotating everything. All you need to do is just keyframe and move or change what you specifically need. So if you don't need it to rotate, don't have it rotate. If you don't need it to scale, don't have it scale. If you don't need to change the opacity, as I said, you don't need to change the opacity one little bit. But in this case, I'm going to say that I want this to rotate a little bit consistently. Now, as I said before, we're going to get into some better quality as we progress. But for now, we're just doing some tests and getting our feet wet, so to speak, on this. So in this case, I am going to go to my rotation. I'm going to give this, make sure my timeline is at the very center. Beginning. That's important. And I'm going to use the rotation over here. That's going to make my first set key. Pretty much every one of these little diamonds is a start and stop point. And that's basically how this works. Now, unlike what I did before, I'm not going to have to go to every single key to do my rotations. In this case, I just want to rotate this so that it goes from point A to point B relatively easy. Now, what I would do is make sure that you're going the right direction. So I'm going to just give this a quick little test. You'll see that there's a little keyframe that appears. If you ever in a situation, you can always hit the undo. But if you're in a situation where you made a keyframe by mistake and you don't know how long ago it was, you can just select the keyframe itself and just hit the delete key, and that should get rid of it for you. And just make sure that you have the actual area you want to get rid of highlighted, or that will be trouble later. But in this case, that's relatively simple. Now, what I'm going to do here is, instead of choosing a keyframe for every single half second, I'm just going to go to my last one, change the what's called revolution over here, change that to, let's put this to 3, and let's see how it looks. Well, it's a little shaky, but again, we'll have a little bit more practice to play around with this. Again, I'm hitting spacebar to basically make this motion happen. So there's a lot more that we could do with this. We could play around with the scale. We could play around with the opacity. I'm actually going to do the opacity just as one last time so you could basically see how you could do a fade in and a fade out. It's going to look a little weird with a ball bounce, but this fade in and fade out that I'm showing you now will be helpful later on during the class. So what I usually end up doing, and this is just my own personal preference, I usually like to start my keys where my object is going to be visible. So in this case, I actually wanted to start be visible at this top line over here. That's perfectly fine. And I could hit the stopwatch in this area. Now you'll notice that the keyframe is going to be made wherever your time slider is. That's normal and okay. And what I'm going to do is now I can bring my time slider to the beginning. And as I said before, I'm going to have this fade into existence as it goes from here to here. Now, easy enough to do. I could just go to the 100% area over here, move that to the left, and you'll notice that this is gone, but there's still this keyframe over here for the opacity. So if I hit the space bar or play, it fades into existence. And I'll show you how to do that again momentarily. So again, I basically selected my area. I turned on my key by hitting the little stopwatch option over here, moved my timeline back, and I just used the opacity, changed that to 0, and that's it. Now I'm also going to have this fade out of existence. So this is where it gets a bit tricky, but once you understand how this works, it's pretty simple. I want there to be an exact keyframe of 100 exactly in this spot. So I don't want this, sorry about that, to be at any other spot besides 100% in this case. So let's see. Actually move that a little bit too much. That's okay though. So if I want to make a copy of 100 here, I could either just kind of click and drag this left to right and the auto key will happen. Or if you want to make an exact key, all you would need to do is go to your left and there's these little diamond options that have these little arrows. If you hit the diamond option over here, it's also called Add Remove Current Keyframe. Just give that a click, and whatever was the last key you had over here, it's just going to make the same value in this case. So this one had 100, so this one will have 100. And if I bring this to the right a little bit more, I'm going to turn off the opacity as it's fading out of existence. So I hit the space bar over here. And I'm making a very simple ball bounce, but it suits our purpose for today, and that's what's important. So once again, space bar, and there's our little animation. Nothing too fancy, but I think it's at least a good starting animation for what we're doing today. So just a quick review. When you are importing any file, now this is true for Illustrator or Photoshop, make sure that whatever you want to move is going to be on separate layers. That part's key. Now once it's imported in properly as a composition retain layer size, you can bring it into your composition over here. Once again, make a new one by going to Composition, New Composition, and then just basically change the settings similar to what we had before. If you need the exact specifications, take a look at the beginning part of the video, or alternatively, Composition, Composition Settings. This basically tells you exactly what you have here. And pretty much you can see anything you need or change to something. So in this case, I'm going to change the duration from 10 seconds to 5. Nice thing about these is you can change them at any time. So, and I only need 5 seconds. So again, for the transforms, again, you could basically hit the little drop down arrows over here and the transform. Anchor point basically moves where the pivot point, scale area, and rotation area are going to be. Position is the basic movement. Scale is basically how big or small your object is. You'll notice that we didn't really do anything with this for good reason. We didn't need it. For rotation, that's basically rotating your object side to side. And opacity affects how much of this we see. Now, when we're ready to make an animation, we can hit this little stopwatch option over here. Make sure that you're where you want your first keyframe to be. And it'll make what's called an automatic set key or auto key. And again, these can be adjusted and changed depending on what's necessary, specifically for the movement. And that's basically how that's going to be able to work. And remember that the keyframe is only going to change what you currently are, or what currently is selected for the little stopwatch area. So in this case, that's why we have so many for the position, because there's so many bumps and hills, so to speak. While with the rotation, there's only 2, and for the opacity, there's 4. Basically a fade in like this, and a fade out like this. That's pretty much all I want to really show for now. Now, what we're going to be doing at a future time is I do want to take a look at some tools that you can use to basically mask out areas that are unnecessary. You'll find that this is going to be helpful when we get into storyboarding. And we're also going to show you how to make video files. Actually take what we have over here and export it in a way that other people can take a look at the videos that you made for yourself. But that's going to get a little bit more complicated. I want everyone to just take a moment to get used to how the motion works, how the transformation works, and so on. We'll leave it at that for now. Don't forget, if this is important, to save this up. I'm going to save this up myself. I might be able to use this for a future lecture. Now, unlike what I've done before, I'm actually going to name this. So I'm going to call this Intro Animation. Should be easy enough to remember. That's it. Well, once again, this is Introduction to Animation and Transformations. Hopefully you found this educational, and have a good night.